This is HFA Speaks, the podcast. I'm your host, Jacqueline Jauregui, a web and social media intern for the Division of Humanities and Fine Arts. The series is called A Season of Celebration, a Multicultural View, an alternative look at the upcoming holiday season from the perspective of different religious and cultural groups. Our guest today is Dr. Joseph Blankholm, a professor at UCSB's Religious Studies Department. He focuses on American religion, secularism and atheism, sociology, and the anthropology of religion. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, it's nice to talk to you.
So, my first question is about your book, The Secular Paradox. So its subtitle is The Religiosity of the Non-Religious. Can you explain to us what that is?
Yeah, for sure. So this is a book that I published last year in 2022. It came out in the summer, so I guess it's been out for about a year now. And that book is the result of a bunch of years of research that I conducted with, I'd say, very secular people in the United States. So people who are atheist, agnostic, humanist, freethinker, but people who take that identity really seriously. So some of them are activists who fight lawsuits against, say, public display of crosses that are supported by government, or they organize lobbying groups in DC. Some of them also are just people who get together locally in face-to-face communities with other people who believe the same stuff that they do. And sometimes they celebrate holidays together. And so what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about the secular paradox and the religiosity of the not religious is the way that not all not religious people, but most atheists and agnostics will believe the same things. And then there are certain moments in life that are important to mark. Weddings and memorial services or funerals are obvious ones. So how do you encounter or approach those moments when you can't lean on clergy or a religious institution? And what I see with very secular people is that they're always reinventing the wheel because they can't turn to these ritual experts. And it's especially difficult for things like memorial services where people sometimes really don't want anybody talking about God at their recently deceased father's funeral. And so they have to invent a ritual again, and these rituals end up looking a lot the same because the conditions are similar. So they're doing religion-like things, but they are absolutely not religious. And what's that about? So that's really the question I explore. I explore it in different ways. There's a chapter on belief, a chapter on community, a chapter on ritual, a chapter on conversion, and a chapter on tradition. So one of the arguments is that there's actually a centuries, if not thousands of year tradition that very secular people participate in. So sometimes you want to mark time, sometimes you want to do holidays. So I think it's interesting to think about in that way.
Mm-hmm. And as far as the belief chapter goes, what extent does belief matter when observing holidays?
Yeah, it's a good question. It totally depends. So for some people, it's the core. So sometimes you'll hear in like public discourse in media, on the news, people will say they want to put Christ back in Christmas because they feel like it's become too consumer focused, and it hasn't been sufficiently focused on really the religious aspect, the belief aspect. And for other people, the belief really doesn't matter. I talked to some pretty hardcore atheists who are like, yeah, we do Christmas. It's wonderful to see my kids be happy on Christmas morning when I give them gifts, and we don't talk about the Christ part of Christmas at all. So it's totally possible to do Christmas without believing anything Christian, but there are, of course, some Christians for whom that's total blasphemy, and you should absolutely talk about Christ in Christmas. And then if you're, say, Jewish, you might, and especially if you're in a blended or interfaith marriage, you might make all different kinds of compromises. So belief still matters, but maybe it's not as big a priority because it causes too much tension if you make it the focus.
What role, especially this is something that happens a lot with Christmas, but what role does marketing have in the secularization of holidays like that?
Yeah, it's a huge, huge part of it. So there's a historian in my field, he's a big deal. His name's Lee Schmidt, and he's got a book on this that's great. And he focuses on different holidays and really like the history of them becoming really good ways to make money. And seasonal holidays are absolutely that, right? You need the new Halloween decorations, you gotta buy the new gifts for Christmas. We all know the deal because we can see it creeping kind of earlier and earlier into the season when the marketing begins. And I don't know, I'm not that old, but when I was your age, that was not really the case. And people would say like, oh, this is weird that it's getting earlier and earlier. But it's partly driven by consumer trends. It's a good way to make money for people who are involved in it. So there's a tension there, right? Where people want to make the holiday about taking a break from capitalism, having time off, spending time with family. And for some people, really thinking about their faith and strengthening their faith. And then there are all these other forces in our culture that are about consumerism. So there's a long history that got us here, and it's been kind of bit by bit where it's become more and more normal.
So we've discussed a little bit of Christianity, a little bit of the secularization of Judaism. Can you go into maybe why so many Jewish people are able to practice Judaism secularly?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's really helpful to think about Jewishness and think about religion, because it kind of breaks our usual understanding of religion, because our understanding of religion is really largely based in Christianity. So when we talk about religion, we're participating in this inheritance. We speak a language we didn't invent. We arrive in this world midstream, and we use the kind of word tools and concepts that we have available to us. And so when it comes to religion, it's something that originates in Christian culture, gets spread around the world through merchants and missionaries for hundreds of years, and they go and they encounter these other cultures, and they're like, what you're doing looks a lot like Christianity, so that's your religion. And then that's kind of how we get the world religions. And then as Europeans bring it back, there's this return influence, and it expands what we mean by religion into this bigger thing that's more inclusive. And then if you think about being Jewish, it's not like Christianity. It's similar to Christianity, but it's not really like Christianity. And you can see it when people try to deconvert. So I interviewed this guy outside of Detroit a few years ago, and he identifies as ex-Jewish. And he was very frustrated when I talked to him. He said, you know, my ex-wife, she won't acknowledge that I'm not Jewish. And my Christian friends can be ex-Jewish. They can deconvert. But because my mother was Jewish, none of my Jewish friends, my ex-wife, my children, my family, they all continue to consider me Jewish, because if your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. That's how it works. You can also convert in, but that's basically how it works. So it's not an identity that one chooses in the same way one chooses Christianity, and yet it's a religion. And so the misfit of that kind of tells the whole story of what religion is. It kind of breaks it, and then we can reassemble these pieces and make better sense of it. So, for instance, some of you might know Richard Dawkins. He's kind of, I think, like the global poster boy for hardcore atheism. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
So Dawkins, a few years ago, had this interview, and he's like, you know, I love doing Christmas carols. I love Christmas. I'm really into it. I'm a Christian atheist. It's like being Jewish and atheist. And so in that sentence, you can kind of see he's like, Jewish and atheist, that makes sense, right? Why can't we think about Christian and atheist? And there's the whole history right there for us, is because you inherit that Jewish identity in most cases, what you believe can be somewhat separate. And there's a long tradition of Jewish people bringing together atheism and making that work. I've interviewed a lot of atheist rabbis as well. But Christian atheist is a lot harder for us to imagine. And so he's kind of arguing for that. But the fact that it's kind of unimaginable, that tells a story about us as well. So I think, yeah, Jewish and atheist is really helpful to think about, because it forces us to make sense of ourselves, even if we're not Jewish.
So speaking of like Christian atheism, and maybe why that's a bit more complex and difficult to understand, you focus on American religion, and we talked about the Christo-Protestant sort of perspective that we take on it in this country. And so why is that difficult to make sense of?
Yeah,
and how is that evolving in the landscape that we have right now?
It's a good question. And how does it fit into holidays too? So comparison's a really easy way to think about it. In US law, it's all built around Protestant churches. If you look at the tax code, which dates to the 1920s, off the top of my head, I think it's 1924 is when we get the Internal Revenue Code. It talks about churches and it talks about ministers. And because we have a bunch of different religions in the US, we're like, oh, you're like a church or you're like a minister, so you get the same protections. So when I was interviewing a Jewish rabbi, she goes, I had to learn the language of church because I administer all these different synagogues around the country, and I want to make sure that they have tax exempt status. And I also want to make sure that my rabbis get taxes off for like a housing allowance. It makes their life easier. Christian ministers get it. So she's like, I need to make us look like a Protestant church. Otherwise, the IRS is going to hassle us. And she's kind of telling that whole story there. She called it playing a Protestant game. And that's kind of what sets the table in the US. And it's not some big conspiracy. It's just that when you've got a bunch of Protestants making your law for hundreds of years, it's going to get cooked in. And in Mexico, it's a really different situation. So one of my PhD students is studying Mexican secularism, and it's a lot of Catholicism setting the table, but also really rejecting Catholicism, because there's this like Marxist nationalist phase in Mexican history that really pushes back against it. So it's structured in different ways. You see the same thing in France. Catholicism kind of goes unmarked. So like they're hyper aware of Islamic symbols in public in France, but churches are all over the place. Crosses are all over the place. And people just don't see them because it's part of the landscape. And so each country has these different configurations. And in the US, it's pretty Protestant. So it's focused a lot on individual belief and individualism as opposed to organized churches, which is kind of the focus if you're in a Catholic dominated country. How your rights work is a little different. And some of that stuff changed when the Supreme Court had no Protestants. That's not the case anymore. But for a little while, it was Catholics and Jewish people who were on the Supreme Court. And so there's a little more focus on tradition and a little more focus on like bigger entities. But yeah, so that's kind of what happens. And then as far as holidays go for that, it's really, US has its own culture when it comes to holidays. And I don't know if I would say, like, is Valentine's Day Protestant? It's kind of like pagan, right? Mm-hmm. But it's also Catholic. I think it's like Saint Valentine. So we have these like disjunctures as well. Do you know what's similar to this? So in Santa Barbara, right? If you look at the architecture, it's this like Catholic architecture all over the place. And if you go down to the courthouse, it's so good in its replication of Spanish Catholic architecture, you'll see Islamic elements in it because it used to be, right, Islamic territory when that was the empire in the Iberian Peninsula. And so that's wonderful. You go down to the courthouse and you can see these remnants. But that's a really intentional thing that the city of Santa Barbara did. It's called Spanish Revival Architecture. And after an earthquake in 1925, they leveled a bunch of stuff. There's very few families that own downtown, and they were like, let's do this. Let's make it look like Spanish Revival. So there's also a Methodist church, a Protestant church downtown Santa Barbara, looks like a Catholic church. So you also have these moments where it's like, oh, that doesn't really make sense. But that's history just kind of layering and stacking it. So, right, we're going to have Protestants celebrating Catholic-ish holidays, not really thinking about it. That's just kind of American religion.
So interesting.
It's so interesting. I agree.
Another aspect of celebrating holidays is community. And so how has that evolved with the secularization of the holidays?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's different ways you can think about it, right? Like some of the really hardcore atheists that I talk to, they don't want anything to do with Christmas. But Christmas basically falls on the winter solstice. So they want to do like a winter solstice celebration, and they'll do that because they want to get together. They want to celebrate something. They want something to take the place of Christmas. So they pluck this thing out and they put something else in there that works for them. And so there's people secularize their holidays. This doesn't happen every year, but a few years ago I went to a secular Dia de los Muertos event in Los Angeles, and it was kind of what you'd expect. I'd say it was like a mix of like really sincere people thinking about their dead, putting pictures of them on an ofrenda, like a table on the stage, but also a lot of white people doing cultural appropriation and everything problematic that comes with that. But this woman who was on stage said something I just think kind of subtly brilliant. She said, we're secular but human. And so we want to mark time. We want to have events where we come together and we can talk about the people we've loved and lost, and we can understand that together. And this offers us an opportunity to do that. And we don't really have anything like that in secular culture, because it's kind of like a blank space of a culture. So we have to take something and kind of make it into our own. And so even though we're looking at appropriation, it's hard not to sympathize too with being secular but human. And so I think when you're thinking about community and people wanting to get together, we see the same thing with like Thanksgiving, right? If you look at the colonial history, obviously problematic.
So you talked about how a lot of your research is done through conducting interviews, and that in essence is ethnography.
Mm-hmm.
So some of that is focused on communities of color.
Mm-hmm.
How does the secularization of their holidays or their cultures, how does that work?
Yeah,
and how is that different from like white Protestant Americans?
It's a great question. It kind of goes back to this question like when you were asking about Jewishness, because Jewishness breaks religion, but it also means if you're secular and Jewish, you have to be kind of different than post-Christian secular, because the fit's not right. And so in the book I talk about it, I say, you know, these are secular misfits. They're people who literally misfit secularism. So when you get rid of Christianity, which is kind of what you do when you get rid of religion, makes a Christian-shaped hole, and then you try to stick something else in there, but the fit of it's going to be different if you used to be Muslim and you, say, have memorized the whole or parts of the Quran. That's in your body, that's in your memory. You train your body to be able to recite it. And so you're not going to fit exactly. And this is true too for like the Black atheists that I interviewed. They deal with all kinds of stuff. Because of a very particular history in the United States of Black religion, we tend to think of Black bodies and Black people as being excessively religious or excessively emotional. And it's an assumption that actually also pervades the Black community. So one woman told me, you know, she was at a conference and a Black woman came up to her. She's a Black woman as well, this woman that I was interviewing. And she said, this woman said, like, you can't be atheist, you're Black. And that doesn't really make any sense on some level, but it does if you think about this longer history where this woman's like, these two things don't go together. This is a contradiction. And so that means that when people want to get together as secular people, or they want to celebrate holidays as secular people, sometimes they sort themselves based on these different identities. And it makes a lot of sense. Sometimes Black atheists want to be around other Black atheists because they have a very particular experience that only other Black atheists can understand. And the same is true of Hispanic atheists that I talked to, who, one guy, it was really beautiful. He's like, you know, I really love the symbol of the cross. I used to have all this clothing, I used to have all this jewelry that had the cross on it. It's just gorgeous. And it makes me sad sometimes. I can't wear that stuff anymore because I don't want to represent that to the public. So he's like, my aunt will give me like a beautiful cross necklace and I just put it in the jewelry drawer. And real sadness, you know? And other people are like, I still celebrate this holiday where we, you know, go around to everybody's house and we drink a punch at the end. And I just do that with my family, even though it's very Christian to do that. And that woman was also like, and my sister, who's a Jehovah's Witness, will not do it. So she like thinks about it in comparison. For the Jehovah's Witness sister, it breaks her religion to do this Catholic stuff. And this atheist woman is like, you know what? This is part of my culture. I'm Mexican American. I'm going to do this. So people negotiate it in different ways, but it all has to do with like, you're not secular in the same way. If you're a Hispanic atheist who used to be Catholic or even Pentecostal, right? It's going to be different. And so attending to those differences, not only is like, yes, it's important to account for diversity, but it's also important to understand how you don't really see the whole picture if you don't listen to different kinds of people. So you don't see how religion breaks when you start to account for other people. You don't see how Christian that history is, and you don't see how kind of post-Christian and white and European the secular is unless you start to look at these other people. Story changes. And that's why diverse perspectives matter, because you're not really seeing it if you're not including these other people.
Well, thank you for trying to tell those stories and delving into that, the secular paradox. Finally, would you like to explain to people watching what your research right now entails?
Oh yeah, sure. It's kind of interesting. So I was brought into this study to continue this study that started more than 50 years ago in 1970. It's called the Longitudinal Study of Generations, and it's tracked more than 370 families that have been interviewed and surveyed 10 times now since 1970, and we just reached the 5th generation for the first time. So great grandchildren? So I'm interviewing the 5th generation. I just interviewed, they're already done. The 5th generation, the 4th generation, the 3rd generation. And in 20 families, I have 3 different generations that we've spoken to, and they're giving perspectives on each other. And I have my questions that I'm really interested in. So I'm like really interested in like the variety among the non-religious, because I think there's so many ways to not be religious. And in my earlier work, I'm just focusing on like a subset. So I'm really interested in like, you know, spirituality and taking people's beliefs and practices that are spiritual really seriously, even when they say they're not religious. What is that? What is astrology, tarot? What are people doing when they make yoga into a religion, but it's like kind of like white yoga? What's going on with all that stuff? And then the bigger question is partly like, you know, how does this stuff get transferred from generation to generation in families? And if people are not religious, or there's kind of like, say, like their grandparents are religious and now the grandchildren are not at all, are we losing values or are values changing? I think you can kind of see in the way I framed it. I'm kind of on team 2. But I think you have to listen, and you have to use different words, and you have to listen really carefully. Because if someone's not using the same words that we used a generation ago to describe what they care about most, we don't just get to ignore them because they're not talking in the way that we think they should. So we have to just train ourselves to listen a little differently. So that's the stuff I'm working on now, and I'm mostly publishing articles right now, and then I'm going to start on a book next year after I get past that stuff.
All right. Well, that's exciting. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.